In a forgotten Colorado town, overrun by a violent biker gang and suffocated by corruption, a quiet 13-year-old boy finds himself at the center of a resistance. As he uncovers the truth behind the gang's smuggling operation, Caleb Dawson becomes the unexpected spark of a movement, one aided by a silent guardian of the woods, a grizzly bear named Milo. With the help of a hardened grandfather, a wounded journalist, and a relentless federal investigator, Caleb leads a grassroots fight to reclaim the town. But when power and politics collide and enemies lurk behind official badges, the battle turns personal. As the lines between man and nature blur, Ridge Hollow becomes a symbol of what can be saved and what it costs to save it. But not every shadow has been chased away, and some scars in the forest still run deep. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. There's a sound only the woods can make, quiet, slow, almost sacred, but that sound dies when fear takes root. And in Ridge Hollow, Colorado, the forest had gone silent. To most people, Ridge Hollow was a speck on a map, a ghost of a town hidden in the folds of the Rocky Mountains. But to Caleb Dawson, 13 years old and raised on cracked boots and hand-me-down denim, it was home. A small cabin on the edge of nowhere, just him and his grandfather Walter, surrounded by a forest older than memory itself. Walter Dawson wasn't just any old man. He was the kind who wore silence like a second skin, who didn't flinch at the sound of thunder, and who kept his war medals in a coffee tin beneath the floorboards, not on the wall. A retired wildlife ranger and a Vietnam veteran, he had the kind of past that didn't need to be spoken. Caleb knew better than to ask. They lived simply, off-grid, off-radar. Mornings were filled with chores and feeding the rescued animals Walter still took in when no one else would. Evenings were spent under the stars, listening to the wind and the forest breathing. But most of all, Caleb loved the stories about the creatures that roamed the ridges, the unspoken rules of the wild, and one story he never stopped thinking about, the grizzly named Milo. Milo wasn't like other bears. Raised in captivity after his mother was shot, Walter had nursed him back from death, bottle by bottle, bruise by bruise. But Walter had never believed in cages. When the time came, he opened the gate. Milo disappeared into the wilderness, and, for years, there were only tracks and whispers. Until Caleb saw him again, that was the day everything began to change. It was early October. Cold enough that the morning frost clung to the pine needles like glass. Caleb was hiking alone, farther than Walter would have liked. He had his sketchbook tucked into his backpack and a wildlife camera strapped across his chest, hoping to capture elk or maybe the family of foxes he'd tracked the week before. But instead, he found something else, down in a gully near Red Creek. Half buried under moss and branches was a black military duffel, heavy, the kind that didn't belong out here. When Caleb unzipped it, his stomach dropped. Rifles, ammunition, plastic-wrapped bricks of something he didn't recognize. But instinct told him it was bad, real bad. Then came the voices. "Left it right here," one man said. "Told you it'd be safe." Two bikers appeared above him on the ridge, leather vests stitched with red snarling jackals. One of them lit a cigarette, the other dragged a shovel. They were less than 30 yards away. Caleb barely had time to slide into the brush. One of them kicked at the duffel. "Still here! Told you this forest's blind. No one out here but birds and bears. Yeah? You hear about that kid who got mauled up near Silver Basin? Nah, what? Found what was left of him a mile from his campsite. Sheriff said it was a bear, big one." The other man laughed, too loud. "Good. Let the animals keep these people scared. Makes our job easier." Caleb's throat went dry. They left after a few minutes, but Caleb didn't move. Not for a long time. When he finally crawled out of the gully, heart thudding like a drum, he looked up and froze. On the ridge where the bikers had just been, a shadow stood between the trees, massive. When we realized that silence isn't peace, and that fear only wins if we let it, people applauded, but not out of obligation. It felt earned. Caleb slipped away before the crowd dispersed. He took the north trail into the woods, alone. The path had been redone in recent months, cleared, marked, lined with small guideposts bearing quotes from the resistance days. One of them read, "The forest knew before we did." He walked for over an hour, stopping at the overlook where he'd once planted his first camera. From here, the town looked small again, like it had when all of this started, like something vulnerable. But now, he saw it differently, not as a place that could be taken, but as something that could be protected. He heard the crunch of boots. Behind him, Maya. "Thought I'd find you here," she said. Caleb nodded but didn't turn. "You skipping your own dedication now?" "It's not mine." "Well," she said, stepping up beside him, "your name's on the list, right under." "Walters?" He looked at her. "I didn't ask for that." "Neither did he," she said, then smiled. "But I think that's why it matters." They stood in silence for a while, watching the wind bend the trees below, the sun climbing higher. "People are calling Ridge Hollow a miracle," she said. "It wasn't," Caleb answered. "It was a choice." She glanced at him. "You know, we've been asked to take Ridge Rising on the road. Workshops, talks, maybe a book tour. You'd come?" Caleb didn't answer for a long time. "I think I'd rather stay here," he said finally. "Help keep the place steady." Maya nodded. "Figured," he turned to her. "But I'll help write it if that's something. That's everything." Back in town, the celebrations continued into the afternoon. Families gathered at the conservation center. Jake led a group of kids on a nature walk, pointing out signs of bear movement, teaching them how to read tree markings and scat like a language. One of the boys asked if the bear still lived nearby. "Yeah," Jake said, "but he's not watching us like he used to." "Why not?" Jake smiled. "Because now we're watching for him." Walter sat on the cabin porch that evening, watching. The sun slipped behind the trees. Caleb joined him, 2 mugs in hand. He passed one over, sat down on the top step, and watched the light turn gold. "They've been calling you a hero again," Walter said. Caleb chuckled. "Not sure how I feel about that. I'd be worried if you were." They sipped in silence. "You see him lately?" Walter asked. "Not in person," Caleb said. "But I saw his tracks last week. He's still circling, still keeping the rhythm." Walter nodded. "Good. World needs a rhythm." The sky turned dark, the stars blinking awake. Somewhere far off, a fox called once, then again. Caleb leaned back on his elbows, looking up. "We should have done this more," he said. "What?" "Just sat, listened." Walter took a long sip. "We didn't have the time then. Now we do." Caleb smiled. A soft rustle came from the woods beyond the fence. Not urgent, not threatening. Just movement. Just presence. They didn't go check. They didn't need to. They knew. Years later, Ridge Hollow stood quiet and strong. A town no longer defined by what it had survived, but by what it had become. The statue of the boy and the bear still watched. Over the conservation zone. Children played beneath it, unaware of the history etched in stone. That was how it should be. Caleb Dawson, now a wildlife biologist, walked the trails daily, not as a scout or a lookout, but as a steward. His cameras tracked elk and foxes now. The forests were healing. So was the town. Milo was gone. His tracks faded over the years, replaced by the signs of new life. Cubs, deer, birds nesting where rifles once hid. But in quiet moments, when the wind moved just right, Caleb swore he could still feel the bear's presence watching from the ridge. He stood there one evening, hands in his pockets, eyes on the horizon, thinking about how it all started, about Walter, about Maya and Elena, about Jake and the others who stayed, who changed, who rebuilt. And then he spoke, not loud, not for anyone but the trees to hear. "In the forest I was prey. But I learned that even prey can roar when the forest fights. With you." Then he turned and walked back home, the trail behind him undisturbed, the path ahead open and steady. The forest had endured, and so had they. "Just remembering and making sure I never forget." Caleb sat beside him. "You think they'll come back? Others like them?" Walter didn't answer right away. "Always," he said finally. "There's always something waiting to take advantage of silence. But now we know how to be loud when it matters." On the final day of Ridge Rising, the town held its first open mic session. Anyone could speak. There was no list, no vetting, just a stool, a mic, and a community willing to listen. Maya went up, told the story of the night her office was burned and how she almost left town that week. "I stayed," she said, "because I realized you don't leave people when they're scared. You stand with them, even if it's hard." Jake followed. Then a teacher, then a 12-year-old girl who had drawn Milo in her school journal and said she wasn't afraid of the woods anymore. Finally, someone called for Caleb. He hesitated. Elena nudged him. "They want to hear it." So he walked up. The sun was setting behind him. The crowd was quiet. No cameras, just neighbors, friends, survivors. "I didn't want to speak," Caleb said. "I'm not good at it, but I was thinking about that first week, when I found the guns in the woods, when I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe I was crazy, or that I'd just make things worse if I told anyone." He paused, but then I remembered something my grandfather told me. He said the forest has rules, and when someone breaks them, the forest knows. And if you love it enough, you help it fight back. He looked up at the crowd. "I think we're the forest now, and I think we finally remembered our rules." Applause didn't explode. It rose, slow, steady, like breath returning to a body. That night, Ridge Hollow lit lanterns across the conservation zone, not as a vigil, not as mourning, but as memory. Glowing lights hung from tree limbs and fences, flickering in the breeze, casting long shadows that danced like spirits. Walter stood beside Caleb, watching the lights sway. "You did good," he said softly. "We did it together." Walter nodded, but his eyes were distant, focused on something in the woods. "Think he's watching?" Caleb asked. Walter smiled. "Of course he is." And deep in the trees, where the last of the lantern light barely touched the undergrowth, a figure moved between the trunks. Slow, steady, a shadow of fur and breath and quiet strength. He didn't step forward. He didn't need to, because the forest no longer needed defending. It had defenders of its own. The statue was unveiled on a cloudless morning. No fanfare, no red ribbon. Just townspeople gathered in the newly cleared plaza at the edge of the conservation zone, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the open sky. The monument had been carved from a single block of local granite, hauled up the ridge over the course of 3 weekends by volunteers using ropes, pulleys, and an old ranger winch Walter had refused to throw out. It stood just under 10 feet tall, and it didn't show a soldier or a flag or a badge. It showed a boy and a bear, not a cartoon or a symbol. A boy standing quietly, hand resting on the back of a massive grizzly who sat beside him, head lifted, watching the horizon. Around them, etched into the base, were pine trees, bent, twisted, but standing tall. Beneath that, in smooth lettering, "We didn't run. We remembered." Caleb didn't want to stand near the front during the unveiling. He hung back, near the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, eyes on the crowd. Jake stood beside him, arms crossed, scanning faces like he still couldn't believe they'd let him come. Maya stood off to the left with her camera, not filming, just observing. Elena stood with a clipboard, coordinating, because that's what she did when things were going too well. Walter was already seated when the tarp came off. He didn't stand, he didn't clap, he just nodded once, a small motion of recognition. Then he leaned back and folded his arms across his chest, like he was finally allowing himself a rest that had been decades in the making. The crowd's reaction wasn't loud, it was reverent. Kids stared up at the granite bear with wide eyes. Elders murmured approval. Someone cried. No one took a selfie. After the unveiling, the mayor, newly elected, younger, and more grounded than the last one, gave a short speech. "This statue doesn't belong to any one person," she said. "It belongs to what we became when we refused to give up." Caleb looked at the patch. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. In the months that followed, more changes came. The old jackal hideouts were torn down. Where one had stood, the town built a community greenhouse. Another was turned into a trail rest stop, with a plaque that simply read, "From harm to harvest." Jake started speaking in schools. Walter began writing a manual for backcountry safety. Maya published a book, not just about the resistance, but about healing. The bear featured on the cover. Caleb refused to pose for the photo. They used his sketch of Milo instead. One morning, early summer, Caleb stood on the ridge again. The air was warm, the wind calm. Below, the town moved slowly. Kids on bikes, someone painting a fence, a truck unloading lumber. He closed his eyes and listened. No fear, no engines, just wind, birds, and the distant hum of a place that had found its rhythm again, and above it all, somewhere deeper in the trees, the quiet watch of a protector whose footsteps no longer needed to be heard. By the time summer reached its peak, Ridge Hollow had become something new. Not polished, not perfect, but purposeful. The kind of place people now pointed to as proof that a town didn't need more police or money to survive an invasion. It needed heart, courage, and each other. No one had put it into words yet, but you could feel it in the way people lingered on porches or waved a little longer when they passed each other on the road. Something had shifted. A quiet pride had taken root. The idea for Ridge Rising started small. Caleb mentioned it offhand one night while sitting around the fire pit behind the cabin. Walter, Elena, Maya, Jake, they were all there. The conversation had drifted from old trail repairs to long-term plans, and somewhere between discussing a broken footbridge and the high school's new forestry club, Caleb had said, "Maybe we should do something to remember it." Not the fear, the fight, the unity. Maya sat up straight. "A gathering? A celebration," Caleb said, "or a warning?" "Both." Walter raised an eyebrow. "You want a festival?" "Not fireworks and food trucks," Caleb said. "More like a statement." They called it Ridge Rising. Word spread fast. Elena reached out to the Conservation Corps. Maya contacted her journalist network. Jake invited former jackals who had turned their lives around. Not all accepted, but some did. Schools sent volunteers. Churches sent tables and tents. Veterans donated tools and manpower. And the town got to work. By mid-July, preparations were in full swing. The clearing near the conservation zone was chosen for the main event. It had once been the site of one of the jackal's hidden caches. Now it was cleared, cleaned, and flattened. Where crates of weapons had once sat buried beneath the pine needles, a stage was now being built, modest, wooden, with a banner stretched across its frame that read, "Ridge Rising, Standing Tall, Together." The event lasted 3 days. It wasn't flashy. No carnival rides or inflatable games. Instead, there were walking tours through the trails that Caleb had mapped, now fully restored, and posted with signs describing their role in the resistance. There were booths run by environmental scientists and forest rangers, workshops on tracking, survival, and wildlife protection. Jake ran 2 of them himself. He spoke plainly, never asked for sympathy, just told the truth. Where he'd been, what he'd done, and why he'd chosen something different. "I thought I was a wolf," he said during one session, his voice carrying over the open clearing. "But all I was doing was chewing the legs off wounded deer. This town gave me a reason to stop." There were tears in the crowd, not dramatic ones, just quiet faces, listening, understanding. Maya curated a gallery on the second day. Photos and sketches, news clippings, annotated maps. One section was dedicated to Milo. The main image was Caleb's original sketch, blown up and framed, placed beside a still from the rescue night. Beneath it a plaque read, "Not tamed, not commanded, just aligned." Walter didn't speak much during the event. He worked, helped set up chairs, managed the perimeter, assisted in cleanup. But he was everywhere. Kids asked him questions. Elders patted his back. A few strangers took photos, which he hated but tolerated. Caleb saw him one evening, sitting on a rock near the back trail, just watching. "You okay?" Caleb asked. Walter took a breath, nodded, asked if he was the same guy who used to ride with the bad ones. Jake didn't lie, said yes he was, and then he sat down and told the boy why he wasn't anymore. By the end of the week, the school had asked him to speak to the senior class. Elena gave her first national interview in May. She wore her ranger uniform, crisp and worn with years of use. She spoke plainly, directly, and without flair. She told them how a gang tried to take a town, how silence nearly let it happen, and how one boy with a camera, a bear, and an instinct for right changed everything. The bear was protecting the land, she said, but Caleb, he protected the truth. The clip went viral. A senator quoted it during a committee meeting. Another introduced a bill for increased funding in rural environmental protection enforcement, naming Ridge Hollow in the proposal. Back in town, life kept moving. The general store opened on Sundays again. The diner added 2 new booths to accommodate the influx of hikers and nature lovers who had read about the conservation zone. The sign near the trailhead now bore a simple, new line beneath the town's name, home of the Ridge Hollow Resistance. Caleb didn't like that much. He preferred the silence of the trees to the attention, but he didn't protest. If the story helped another town fight back somewhere else, maybe it was worth it. The footage of Milo during the clearing ambush was replayed across countless networks, documentaries, and social platforms. Scientists wrote papers about animal behavior. Theories swirled online about bear intelligence, protection instincts, even military-style tracking. But Caleb didn't need a study. He'd looked into those eyes. He'd seen what the bear chose to protect. And it wasn't just him. It was all of them. Maya sat with him one evening near the ridge. She'd brought her camera, but it stayed in the bag. "They want a sequel," she said. Caleb didn't turn to look at her. "There won't be one." "I know," she said. "That's what I told them." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light shift through the trees. "I get letters now," Maya said finally, "from people, strangers, wanting to know how we found the courage." Caleb rubbed the dirt from his palms. "We didn't." She tilted her head. "No, we just didn't have the choice to lose." Later that week, a small ceremony was held by the state to formally recognize the efforts of those involved. They offered medals, speeches, even a parade. Ridge Hollow declined the parade, but they sent 3 representatives, Elena, Maya, and Caleb. Caleb stood on stage for the first time, not because he wanted to, but because Maya asked him to. When the microphone was handed to him, he didn't have a speech. He didn't have notes. He looked out at the crowd, then down at the forest below. "I'm not brave," he said. "I was scared most of the time. So was everyone. But we loved where we lived more than we feared losing it. And that was enough." He stepped away from the mic, returned to his seat, and didn't say another word. The applause didn't matter to him. What mattered was the call he got the next morning from a boy in a small town 2 states over. The boy said his school was near a logging site that had started attracting strange trucks at night. His uncle had tried to report it and was told to stop asking questions. The boy said he'd watched the footage. He said he believed Caleb. He asked what he should do. Caleb paused, then said, "Watch, record, wait. Don't fight yet, just see." The boy said, "Okay." Then he hung up, and that was how it spread, not with medals, not with money, but with stories, and eyes that refused to look away. The first time Caleb saw Jake walk into the town meeting wearing a Ridge Hollow volunteer badge, he didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't smile, just watched. It wasn't mistrust, it was acknowledgement, a quiet kind of understanding between 2 people who had both stood in places they didn't want to be. Caleb had led, Jake had followed. But now they stood beside each other, not across. It had taken weeks for the town to accept Jake. Some still hadn't. He understood. Every time he walked into the diner, eyes followed. Some conversations paused when he entered. Others got louder, on purpose. He didn't fight it. He swept floors when no one asked him to. He helped the librarian replace shelves damaged in the fire. He showed up to town maintenance days early, stayed late. He said little, did much. Caleb saw the change in him, not in what he said, but in what he didn't. The bravado was gone, the defiance. In its place, quiet action. One morning, they rebuilt the fence around the community garden. Jake dug holes. Caleb set posts. At one point, Jake stood up, wiped sweat from his brow, and said, "I used to laugh at people who did this kind of thing." Caleb didn't answer, just handed him another board. "You think it's enough?" Jake asked. Caleb pounded a nail in without looking up. "It's a start." Others followed his example. Not everyone wore vests or carried guns during the Jackal days. Some were just enablers, watchers, people who let fear turn into complicity. A few came forward, offered help, testimony, labor. Elena made it clear. Redemption was offered, but not given freely. They had to earn it. One of them was Charlie, a former mechanic who once fixed the Jackal's bikes and looked the other way when blood showed up on the tires. Now he taught shop classes at the high school, starting each semester with a full disclosure of who he'd been. "You want to know what I did?" he asked the class. "Ask. I'll answer, but I won't lie, and I won't expect you to forgive me." The students listened. Some of them even thanked him. Across town, a new initiative took root. Walter, reluctant as always, had agreed to help launch a youth forest ranger mentorship program. It started with 5 students, 3 boys, 2 girls, all between 12 and 15. They met at the ranger station every Saturday, learning how to track animals, read weather patterns, navigate without a GPS. Caleb joined as a co-leader. He didn't feel like a teacher, but he knew the woods, and he knew what it meant to be 13 and feel like the world was too big, too loud, too dangerous. During one session, one of the boys asked, "What do you do when you're scared in the woods?" Caleb thought for a long time before answering. "You listen," he said, "not to the fear, to everything else, the wind, the ground, the silence. If you panic, you'll make mistakes, but if you listen, you'll find your way." They wrote it down. The second wave of rebuilding focused on connecting Ridge Hollow to neighboring towns that had experienced similar pressure. Elena organized a regional summit held in a decommissioned ranger hall just outside the county border. Representatives from 4 towns attended, each bringing their own stories, some still unraveling, others only beginning to be understood. The theme of the summit wasn't resistance, it was transformation. Maya spoke first, outlining how media could be used not just as exposure but as defense. "The truth won't always stop bullets," she said, "but it can slow them down. And sometimes that's all you need to survive." Walter gave a rare address, short, stern, honest. "You won't win by being louder, you'll win by outlasting them. Thugs burn fast, but if you stand long enough, if you keep showing up, they wear down. They always do." Jake gave a talk too. He wasn't scheduled, but someone asked him to speak. He stepped up, cleared his throat, and said, "I thought power was fear, but it's not, it's community. That's what scared us the most, when people stopped looking afraid." Applause followed, quiet, respectful, earned. After the summit, Ridge Hollow began to host monthly intertown meetings. Information was shared, support systems built, surveillance equipment was traded. Former gang members from other towns joined Jake's work in the forest, training with veterans, helping install wildlife cameras and boundary monitors. The resistance had started as a whisper. Now it was a network. Back home, Caleb continued to maintain the trails. Milo's presence had faded again. Less sightings, fewer tracks, but not gone. Caleb believed the bear had simply returned to his deeper routines. Watching, guarding, trusting that the two-legged ones now understood their role. One evening, Caleb returned from a day hike to find a package waiting at the cabin. No name, no return address. Inside was a patch, green and brown, a stitched emblem of a tree surrounded by a ring of stars. Below it, one line of text: Wildlands Peacekeepers, Civilian Auxiliary. Elena appeared at the porch with a second patch, already sewn onto her own jacket. "They're building something," she said. "A network of trained civilians, eyes in the woods, protectors of the forgotten places. They want you on the founding board." The library started hosting monthly workshops on civil defense and community communication. Elena returned briefly to train a wildlife monitoring team that included 3 former jackals, now part of the town's forest patrol unit. They wore green jackets instead of leather vests. They reported sightings of illegal activity directly to the state, with proof and documentation. Jake was one of them. He spent more time in the woods than in town. He said he liked the silence better. Walter told him that was the first sign he might be worth keeping around. One day, Caleb took a long hike alone, past the old fire tower, across the glacial stream that had once hidden a jackal supply drop. He climbed the ridge path where the first camera had captured Milo. He sat for hours beneath the same tree and waited. Near dusk, he heard the familiar crunch of leaves. Milo emerged slowly from the trees, larger now, scar still visible on his flank, but calm. His movements were unhurried, measured. He looked at Caleb for a long time and then lay down, not out of exhaustion, out of trust. Caleb didn't move. They stayed that way until the stars came out and the forest hummed with the low music of insects and distant wind. And Caleb knew this place, this town, this forest, this community, they weren't broken anymore. They had bent, almost to the point of breaking. But they hadn't. They had healed. The story of Ridge Hollow didn't stay a secret. For long, it couldn't. Not after the footage, not after the arrest, not after the photo of a wounded grizzly standing in the clearing went viral with the caption, "Nature defends its own." It started as a whisper on alternative news sites. Then came the headlines, then the cameras, and finally the questions. The country wanted to know what really happened in the little Colorado town no one had heard of before. The first reporter arrived in early April. He was polite, clean-cut, and walked around the town with a notepad he never seemed to use. Elena met with him, gave him the same line she'd given every agency before and since. The people defended their home. That's the story. He smiled like he understood, and then spent the rest of the day chasing Caleb around town, trying to get a quote. He didn't get one. Caleb wasn't trying to be rude, he just didn't want to be famous. He still had dirt under his nails most mornings, still walked the perimeter of the forest with a radio on his belt and a pair of binoculars swinging at his side. The truth was, Ridge Hollow didn't feel much different to him. The trees still whispered. The wind still moved through the branches like an old hymn. The bear still came and went. The town just stood a little taller now, but the world outside kept calling. By late April, Maya's documentary had aired. It was clean, honest, and devastating. It didn't dramatize anything. It didn't need to. The story told itself. Her footage showed. The early resistance, the silent build-up, the acts of quiet courage, and the night Milo broke the siege. When the credits rolled, it ended not with Caleb's face, but with a wide aerial shot of the forest, untouched, wild, and enduring. The reaction was immediate. Donations poured in to rebuild the town's infrastructure. Grants were offered. Journalists kept asking for interviews. National agencies invited Elena to speak on environmental crime enforcement. Even the state governor reached out to Walter, offering him a commendation for distinguished civil bravery. Walter declined, "They want to give me a plaque for doing what I should have done," he said. "I don't need a reward to remember the price." But some recognition was harder to turn down. Elena received an Environmental Hero Award from the Department of the Interior. She accepted it only after they agreed to fund a permanent wildlife monitoring program in Ridge Hollow. She handed the plaque to Caleb when she got back. "This belongs to you more than me," she said. Caleb just stared at it. "I didn't save the forest." "You gave it a voice," she replied. "That's more than most people ever do." Meanwhile, Jake kept working. He stayed out of the spotlight, but people noticed. He was always the first to volunteer. He helped rebuild the library steps, fixed fences, repainted a barn after someone tagged it with leftover jackal graffiti. No one asked him to. He just did. One afternoon, a kid at the school recognized Jake. The frost was gone from the grass. The roads were still cracked, but now there were hands fixing them, real human hands, not contracted crews or federal replacements. Locals, the same ones who had spent months in silence, now worked shoulder to shoulder, hammers in hand, with the weight of fear finally lifting off their backs. Caleb rose early every day, not because he had to, but because something inside him needed to. The routine grounded him. Feed the chickens, check the cameras, clear the brush near the path to the West Trail. Sometimes Jake would meet him by the tree line with fresh tools slung over one shoulder and 2 canteens of coffee. They didn't speak much those mornings. They didn't need to. Milo hadn't been seen in over a week, but his tracks still showed up in the softened earth after rain. Large, deep, deliberate, always in a wide arc around the property, never too close, never too far. Walter called it a sentry pattern. Caleb called it trust. Back in town, the rebuilding had taken shape with a quiet rhythm. The community center, once blackened and ruined, now stood repainted and stronger, its new foundation poured by a mix of veterans, high school seniors, and volunteers from across the county. No one got paid for the work. No one asked to be. Maya oversaw the digital archive project. Her office was back in use, though she'd kept the broken remnants of her old desk in the corner, scorched, split, but still standing. "A reminder," she said, "that not everything that's burned stays broken." On her wall hung a series of screenshots, the footage of Milo during the rescue, Caleb guiding Maya out of the clearing, the drone shots of the jackals fleeing through the forest like startled prey. In the center of the room sat a worn, leather-bound notebook. The original field journal Caleb had started during the first weeks of their resistance. Every sketch, every route, every name. Maya was working with the National Historical Society to get it preserved. She said one day, kids would read about Ridge Hollow in civics class. Caleb didn't care about that. He just didn't want anyone to forget what it felt like to be hunted in your own home. The biggest change came when the town council voted to designate the Northern Ridge as a permanent conservation zone, protected land named after Walter Dawson. They unveiled a plaque beneath the main oak on the Ridge Trail, carved from ironwood, engraved with the words, "Here stood a man who chose the forest and stood for everyone in it." Walter didn't attend the unveiling. He said he didn't need his name on a tree to know what he'd done. Instead, he spent the morning fixing the gate behind the cabin, humming a half-forgotten war tune under his breath. Caleb watched him from the porch. "You gonna at least go see it later?" Walter didn't look up. "I've got trees that need more fixing than that plaque." Jake laughed from the woodpile. "You realize they're gonna name a bench after you too, right?" Walter grunted. "Tell them to use good lumber. I ain't sitting on no pine." Later that day, a school bus arrived at the edge of the conservation area. A small group of kids stepped off, led by their teacher, a woman who had once refused to speak about the jackals during the worst of the silence. Now she carried laminated trail maps and a folder of printouts. Caleb met them by the information kiosk, which he'd helped build the week before. "You're Caleb Dawson," one of the boys said. He nodded. "My dad says you saved the whole town." Caleb knelt to tie his boot. Nah, the town saved itself. I just walked first. The boy seemed satisfied with that. The next day, a national camera crew came to town. They wanted interviews, coverage, a follow-up piece for the documentary Maya had sold to a streaming platform. Caleb sat for one interview. Simple, quiet, nothing grand. He didn't want to talk about Milo. He didn't want to talk about Rex. He wanted to talk about the ridge, about how bears hibernate not because they're weak, but because survival requires silence sometimes, and how silence doesn't mean surrender. When the interviewer asked what scared him the most during those weeks, he didn't say the guns or the threats or even the night they burned Milo's first den. He said, "Watching my neighbors stop looking each other in the eye. By summer, the town was different, not shiny, not perfect, but stronger." Until he saw Milo standing over a man who once called himself King of Ridge Hollow. Jake approached Elena first, hands raised, voice shaking. "I don't want to be them anymore," he said. She didn't cuff him, didn't shout, just looked at him, long and hard. "You talk," she said. "You tell us everything. You help clean up what you helped wreck." And he did. Jake named names, gave locations, uncovered supply caches hidden in the hills. He handed over burner phone numbers, account aliases, and a list of those still loyal to the network beyond Ridge Hollow. He cried once. When he talked about what happened to the dog, he'd been ordered to kill for a message. That night, Jake sat with Caleb and Walter on the porch of the cabin. He didn't say much, just stared at the trees. "I thought being with them would give me something," he said quietly. "Turns out all it gave me was silence I couldn't live with." Walter handed him a mug of coffee. "That's the first honest thing I've heard all day." Across the region, the impact spread. Marshal Trent Bauer disappeared 3 hours after Rex's arrest. His SUV was found abandoned on a logging road near the state line. The federal agencies issued a warrant, and a full-scale manhunt followed. Rumors swirled that he had fled to Mexico, or that he was hiding in the northern Rockies under a different name. Others said the cartel had handled him once he became a liability. No one knew for sure. What they did know was that the command structure protecting the jackals had started to crack. Within a week, 2 allied gangs in neighboring counties went silent. One disbanded, the other collapsed from infighting. Seizures and arrests followed. And everywhere, Milo's image was there, grizzled, wounded, standing over the fallen. A living symbol of retribution that no amount of propaganda could erase. But redemption wasn't just for the town. It was for those still learning what that word meant. Jake started helping Walter around the property, fixing fences, cleaning out the old animal sheds. One morning he showed up with supplies and asked Caleb if he could help replace the camera traps in the western ridge. He didn't wait for permission, just followed Caleb into the woods and worked in silence until the sun went down. "You think I can come back from this?" Jake asked as they reached the clearing. Caleb didn't answer at first. Then he looked toward the trees. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think if you keep showing up, the forest will tell you when you've earned it." Jake nodded. That was enough. Rex Maddox was held in a federal facility 3 states away. No bail, no visitors. His mugshot circulated in every article, but he refused to speak to the press. Rumor was he still woke up screaming sometimes, muttering about the bear. Walter sent him a letter. It was short. No threats, no venom. It read, "The forest gave you a warning. You didn't listen. Now you have. Time to think about it. Use it well." No reply ever came. That weekend, Ridge Hollow held a town meeting, the first since the ordeal. It was quiet, modest, folding chairs in the community center, coffee in paper cups. The lights still flickered, but people came, and they stayed. Elena stood up and explained how the resistance had worked, not the secret details, just the truth, that the town had protected itself when no one else would. That unity had been their strongest weapon. Maya stood next. She told them that the national media wanted interviews, that there would be questions, cameras, opportunists, and that they had a choice, tell their story their way, or let someone else do it for them. They voted. Unanimously, Ridge Hollow would speak, but only together. Later that night, Walter, Caleb, and Maya sat around the fire pit behind the cabin. The stars were out, the kind of stars you only see after something terrible has passed. When the smoke clears, when the sky finally remembers how to shine, Maya lifted her camera and pointed it toward the woods. "You think he's still out there?" Caleb nodded. "He never left. He just knows we don't need him as much right now." Walter sipped his coffee. "He'll come when we do." And somewhere in the darkness, deep in the pine-soaked hills, something moved, slow, silent, watching, not hunting, just making sure the forest still held. Snow melted slow in Ridge Hollow. By the time spring reached the valley, the trees looked like they were exhaling after a long-held breath. "You burned your own house down," Caleb said. Rex's smile faded. "You think this is over, don't you?" he said. "Because of a few videos, because of some attention online. Let me tell you how this ends." He pulled a pistol from his belt and pointed it at Maya's head. Caleb didn't flinch. "If you kill her, you lose everything." "I already lost everything," Rex shouted. "Because of you." A growl rolled through the trees then, low, deep, unmistakable. Rex turned, confused. What was that? Another growl, closer. Then Milo charged. The bear exploded into the clearing from the tree line, a blur of fur and fury, eyes burning gold. Chaos followed. The jackals panicked. One fired, missing wide. Another ran. Milo barreled into Rex, sending him flying backward. Caleb sprinted to Maya, cutting her bonds with the knife hidden in his sleeve. Elena's voice crackled in his ear. "We're moving!" Gunfire erupted around them. Walter and Benny emerged from the woods, covering the escape. Milo stood over Rex, growling, blood dripping from his shoulder, eyes locked on the man who had brought violence into the forest. But he didn't kill him. He waited, and then stepped away. Rex tried to crawl, reaching for his gun. But Walter arrived. First, rifle raised. "Don't—" Rex looked up at the old man, broken and breathless. "You don't get to choose what happens next," Walter said. "We do." By the time federal agents arrived, alerted by the live stream Elena had triggered during the rescue, Rex was zip-tied to a steel post, bloodied, silent. The footage had already gone global. Milo had become a symbol. Caleb, a name people chanted. Online. Maya was taken to the clinic. She didn't speak until her wounds were cleaned, and then she asked for her laptop, because the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, Ridge Hollow had hope, and the forest was silent again. Not in fear, but in peace. The morning after Rex Maddox was arrested, Ridge Hollow woke up different. Not louder, not joyful, but lighter, as if something deep in the town's bones had been lifted. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't even relief. It was breath, the kind of breath that comes after you've been holding it for too long. Caleb walked down Main Street before the sun rose. There was snow on the ground, untouched but already melting under the weak orange light of dawn. Shop windows were still boarded in places. The post office bore fresh scorch marks on one wall. The bakery had a broken front step from where someone, likely a jackal, had kicked it in during one of their quiet night warnings. But it was all still standing. Walter joined him, hands in his coat pockets, moving slow but steady. He'd taken a hard hit during the rescue, a fractured rib and a few stitches on his brow, but he hadn't complained. "Just told the doctor to patch him up fast. They'll be watching the news this morning," Walter said. Caleb nodded. "Good, let them see what we did. They'll see the bear first." Caleb almost smiled. "Milo's already got more views than all of Maya's articles combined," Walter grunted. "Doesn't surprise me. World pays attention when nature fights back." They paused near the town square, where a few volunteers had already begun sweeping up broken glass. Across the street, Maya leaned against a lamppost, her face still marked with healing bruises. A pair of crutches rested beside her, though she didn't seem to need them now. She had a fresh bandage on her cheek and a laptop tucked under one. "You're supposed to be resting," Caleb said as he walked up to her. She shrugged. Resting is for people who can afford to sit still. I've got a story to finish. Walter tilted his head. You already published the footage. That was the headline, Maya said. Now comes the history. That afternoon, the federal agents remained in town longer than anyone expected, not just to process Rex Maddox, but to sort through the digital mountain of evidence the resistance had compiled. Maya gave them terabytes of footage, encrypted messages, audio recordings. Elena provided aerial drone maps of movement through federal lands. Walter handed over old ranger documents, showing how the terrain had been exploited. And then there was Jake. He was maybe 20, maybe younger, lean, tattooed, and missing 3 teeth from a fight he didn't talk about. He'd been one of the jackals, lower tier, a runner mostly, but loyal, until he saw what Rex had nearly done. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came not from a gunshot or an explosion, but from the sudden silence on the radio. Maya had been sending regular check-ins from her end of town every 30 minutes like clockwork. Steady as your breath. But now it had been almost 2 hours. Caleb tried her line twice, then a third time, no response. No static, nothing, just dead air. Elena looked up from the comms table. Still nothing? Caleb shook his head. She wouldn't go dark without warning. Walter was already rising, grabbing his coat, his service pistol, his flashlight. Then, we assume the worst until we know otherwise. They split into 2 trucks, Walter and Elena in one, Caleb and Dee Riley, now part of the resistance, in the other. They moved fast, headlights off, keeping to the back roads. The snow was falling again, thicker now, turning every sound into a whisper, every movement into a ghost. The streets of Ridge Hollow were empty. The fear that had once made people hide was now replaced with something else. People knew a reckoning was coming, and they were waiting for it. Maya's office above the library was dark when they arrived. The back entrance had been forced open, the lock mangled. Inside, her desk chair was overturned, papers scattered, a mug shattered across the floor. One of the laptops was missing. So was Maya. On the wall, scrawled in thick black marker across one of her photos, were 5 words. Bring the boy, or she dies. Caleb stared at the message, jaw clenched, fists shaking. He didn't ask who had done it. He already knew. The handwriting was all over it. Rex Maddox. It wasn't just retaliation. It was personal. Elena picked up a burner phone left on the floor. It was still recording. She hit play. The screen lit up with a video. Grainy, handheld, taken in what looked like an abandoned logging yard. Maya sat in a chair, tied at the wrists, blood on her lip, one eye beginning to swell. Behind her stood Rex, smiling like a man who'd already won. This is for the kid, he said. You got 48 hours to bring him to me, alone, unarmed, or she disappears. Forever, you've got the location. No law, no tricks, just the boy. You want to play soldier? Fine, let's see how far you're willing to go. The video ended. Walter looked at Caleb. It's a trap. I know, Caleb said. You're not going. I wasn't asking. Elena exhaled slowly. We can't risk the rest of the network. If they get Caleb, they kill the leverage, but if we don't act, Maya dies. Walter walked to the window, staring out at the snowfall like it could offer an answer. We do both. We make it look like we're playing their game. Then we change the rules. The next day passed in silence. No word from Maya, no more messages. The logging yard lay north of town, deep in the abandoned timber fields that hadn't been touched in 20 years. Perfect ground for an ambush. No cell towers, no roads, just silence and tall pines. The team prepped carefully. Caleb would go in alone, visibly unarmed, wearing a mic hidden in the collar of his coat. Elena and Walter would set up overwatch. Benny and Dee would circle wide, laying perimeter traps and cutting off exit routes. At first light, Caleb left on foot. It was his choice. He didn't tell anyone, but before he left the cabin, he walked out to the edge of the woods and stood, still for a long time. And then, like smoke through trees, Milo emerged. He didn't approach, just stood 10 yards away, watching. Caleb didn't speak. He just nodded once, and the bear disappeared. The logging yard was exactly what they expected, open, exposed, surrounded by thick forest. An old sawmill rotted at the far end. Rusted cranes and machinery stood like skeletons under the snow. The center was a clearing. Rex waited there with 3 men. Maya sat at his feet, still bound, bruised but alive. Her head lifted when she saw Caleb, and even in that moment, she managed the smallest nod. "You came," Rex called out, stepping forward. Caleb didn't stop walking. He entered the clearing with his hands visible, coat open to show he was unarmed. "I'm here," he said. "Let her go." "Not yet," Rex said. "We're not done talking." Caleb's eyes never left Maya. "You got what you wanted." "Oh, I want a lot more than this," Rex said. "You made me look weak. You embarrassed me. This town used to flinch when they heard an engine. Now they film us like we're clowns. That's your fault." The footage spooked them, but it didn't stop them. "They're going to try to erase us before the rest of this spreads too far." Caleb nodded. "Then we have to hit them before they move." Everyone looked at him. "You want to go back?" "Into the woods?" Elena asked. He didn't hesitate. "They're watching the town. They're expecting fear. But they're not watching the forest anymore. Not since Milo." There was a silence after the name. Walter finally broke it. "He's right. If we wait, they hit us on their terms. But if we move first, we make them scramble." Elena finished. An hour later, the plan was in motion. The team split into 3 units. Elena and Walter would coordinate from the station, monitoring drones and relays. Maya would remain on comms, controlling the media feed and handling the live uplink if the operation turned south. Caleb would lead the field team, a small, fast-moving strike unit made up of 4 volunteers, all locals who had seen enough of the jackal's cruelty to risk everything. They set out just before dusk. The snow had thickened but remained manageable, masking their movement as they crossed into the dense woods north of the ridge. Caleb moved at point, guiding them through the less-used paths, his instincts sharpened by weeks of watching, studying, and surviving. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Every so often they paused, listening for the sounds that didn't belong, engine hums, muffled voices, the metallic clink of weapons. But there was nothing. At the base of the clearing, they stopped. Through the trees, Caleb spotted the fire pit. It burned low, a small orange glow barely visible beneath a tarp canopy. Around it were 3 bikes, a rusted black SUV and a folding table with a radio and field maps. No sign of the men, but Caleb knew they were close. He gave the signal. The others split, flanking the clearing in silence. He moved closer, staying low. Then a twig snapped behind him. He froze. Another snap. Closer this time. He turned, eyes wide, just in time to see a shadow lurch from the trees. But it wasn't a man. It was Milo. The bear was bigger than Caleb remembered, fur darker, thicker. Blood still staining his flank, where the wound had begun to heal. His breath steamed in the cold air. He looked Caleb dead in the eye, and then past him, toward the clearing, and then he growled. It wasn't a warning. It was a call. Chaos erupted. The jackals opened fire from the tree line, bullets tearing through the underbrush, ripping branches apart. Caleb hit the dirt, rolled, and shouted into his radio, "Contact! North line! Ambush! Move!" The others returned fire with flash pellets and noise bombs, just enough to confuse. Milo charged through the clearing like a freight train, roaring as he barreled into the gang's position. Screams followed, raw, panicked. Caleb scrambled toward the comms table. He grabbed the radio, found the frequency Elena had told him to listen for, and hit the broadcast. "Live feed active," Maya said on the other end. "We've got visual." "Say that again, Caleb." He raised the mic. "They're here, armed. We have footage, we have live visual. This is proof. They attacked first." "Repeat, they ambushed civilians." Behind him, one of the jackals tried to run. Milo lunged, swiping the man off his feet like a rag doll, then stood over him, growling low, but he didn't kill him. He just held him there, breathing. Elena's Voice came through. "We've got it. Pull out. Repeat. Fall back now." Caleb looked at the clearing, now scattered with downed gear, blood and broken pride. The jackals weren't retreating in formation. They were fleeing. He turned to Milo. The bear met his gaze again, and then walked back into the trees. By the time the team reached the station, the footage had already hit the national news. Eleanor had fed it to 3 independent journalists who confirmed the video's authenticity. Images of the attack, of Milo's appearance, of Caleb's voice calling for help, all of it was live, and the country was watching. Walter stood beside Caleb as they listened to the broadcast, eyes on the glowing screen. "You were the bait," Walter said softly. Caleb nodded. "But you were also the warning." That night the streets of Ridge Hollow were quiet again, but not with fear, with anticipation, because something had shifted. The bear had come down from the mountain, and now the wolves were running. He knew someone was baiting him, and then suddenly Rex looked straight at the camera, right into the lens. Caleb's breath caught. Rex raised a hand, pointed toward the ridge, toward Caleb's position. "They know," he whispered into the radio. Before Eleanor could respond, a gunshot cracked through the trees. A bullet struck the rock inches from Caleb's head, spraying stone and dirt. He rolled, grabbed the pack, and sprinted down the slope. Another shot rang out, missing wide. The jackals were advancing. Not fast, but purposeful. Caleb's lungs burned as he ran. His foot caught a root, and he went down hard, skidding into a gully. He scrambled up, ducked into the trees, and pressed flat against a boulder. His hands moved without thinking, pulling. The final trap from his pack. A sound mine built from an old fire alarm and 6 batteries. He placed it on the trail and ran. 10 seconds later, the forest screamed. The sound mine triggered a piercing, high-pitched shriek designed to mimic a predator's warning call. It was too loud, too close, and it drove even the toughest man to cover his ears. The jackals stopped chasing. Caleb didn't. He pushed through brambles, over a ridge, and into the backup trail, where Elena waited with the extraction ATV. She was already moving before he climbed aboard. They didn't speak until they reached the ranger station. Inside, Maya was glued to the monitor. The footage had streamed perfectly, Rex's face in the light, the gang stumbling in chaos, the weapons clearly visible. Enough to confirm criminal activity, enough to raise suspicion in places where it mattered. She turned to them, face pale but smiling. It's live, uploaded, mirrored and archived. 3 major outlets have it already. It's not a secret anymore. Walter entered, carrying a radio, his face grim. "They're going to come back hard." "They already are," Elena said, "but now they're fighting the light." Caleb sat down slowly, removing his gloves, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. "They saw me." Maya looked at him. "You were wearing a mask." "They still knew." Walter stepped closer. "Then let them know what they're up against." Across town, the jackals regrouped. Rex was silent, staring at the phone screen as the footage of their ambush spread like wildfire online. His men watched him, nervous. He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he smiled. "They want to play smart," he said. "Fine." He pulled out his own phone and made a call. "Bring her in," he said. "Let's see how brave the kid is when she's the one paying the price." A voice crackled back. "She won't talk. She doesn't have to." Then he ended the call. The next phase had begun, and Ridge Hollow wasn't ready for what was coming next. The wind howled through Ridge Hollow like it carried voices from the past, warnings etched into the bones of trees that had seen too many winters and too much blood. Snow had started to fall, the first of the season, light but steady, blanketing the branches and softening the ground. It should have brought peace. Instead, it was a veil, covering fresh tracks, muting the distant sound of danger closing in. At the ranger station, the mood had shifted. The footage from the ambush had gone viral, millions of views within hours, picked up by online outlets, message boards, even a few major networks. Comments flooded in, some offered support, others disbelief. a few veiled threats. But the truth was out, and now the world was watching. Caleb stood at the back of the station, studying the Northern Ridge Trail through binoculars. His fingers ached from the cold, but he didn't move. He hadn't slept in 24 hours. None of them had. There was no time. After the ambush, Rex Maddox had gone silent. The gang hadn't been seen in town since. No bikes, no boots, just absence. But absence, Caleb had learned, was its own kind of message. Elena entered, brushing snow from her shoulders. She crossed the room and dropped a set of printed satellite scans onto the table. "They're regrouping outside the perimeter," she said. "A clearing north of Red Creek. No structures, no roads, but there's a fresh fire pit and at least 3 warm vehicle signatures. They're dug in." Walter leaned over the maps. "Why pull back now?" "Because they're planning something worse," Maya said from the far corner. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from hours of screen time, fingers still tapping away at the keyboard. "Bowers' reinforcements?" Caleb asked. "No doubt." "How many?" "3 so far, maybe more behind them. They're not here to negotiate." Caleb looked at his grandfather. "So what do we do?" Walter didn't answer right away. Then he said, "We finish what we started, and we make sure the world sees what happens when good people refuse to stay quiet." Maya nodded. "We go public." Caleb grabbed his gear, his maps, and his recordings. "We go loud," he said, because silence was no longer safety, and truth was now the most dangerous weapon they had. The wind shifted just after sunset. It came down from the ridgeline in heavy gusts, dragging with it the scent of pine, damp earth, and the faint, unnatural smell of diesel exhaust. Caleb crouched behind a rock shelf, eyes fixed on the tree line below. In the fading light, everything looked still, peaceful, even. But Caleb had lived here long enough to know that silence wasn't peace, not anymore. His breath fogged in front of him as he adjusted the strap on his pack. Inside it were the tools of a different kind of war. Motion-triggered noise emitters, infrared camera traps, flash grenades built from scavenged parts, a signal jammer the size of a paperback. None of it was lethal. That had been Elena's rule from the start, but all of it could disrupt, disorient, and delay. And tonight, delay was all they needed. From his left, Elena's voice came low over the radio. "Positions confirmed. Myers. A team is in place at the Overlook. Walter's holding the Eastern Trail. You ready, Caleb?" He pressed the mic to his mouth, whispering, "Ready." "On your mark." Caleb tightened his gloves and scanned the terrain one last time. The clearing below was their chosen battleground, surrounded by thick forest, narrow access points, and high ground on 3 sides. It had once been a ranger supply depot, decades ago, long since abandoned and swallowed by the forest. Now it was bait. He triggered the first device, a low-frequency emitter placed behind a broken tree trunk. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, like the buzz of a large animal, something big moving through the underbrush, something threatening. It echoed just enough to pull attention without giving away its source. Within minutes, the bait worked. Engines rumbled in the distance. The sound crept in slow, cautious. 3 bikes, then a truck. Caleb watched them through the scope of a spotting monocular, heart pounding in his ears. The jackals arrived with their usual arrogance. Headlights off, vests unzipped, weapons slung low like fashion accessories. One of them lit a cigarette, casting a flicker of orange into the dark. Caleb counted 6 men, 2 scouts, 3 riders, 1 driver. He recognized the one in front, Kane, the one who had threatened Maya outside the library 3 weeks ago. The gang moved into the clearing, fanning out. One of them checked the old structure, another swept a flashlight over the ground. They were expecting trouble, just not the kind they were about to walk into. Caleb waited until they were in position. Then he sent a single pulse through his transmitter. The flashbangs ignited with a burst of light and sound that shattered the stillness. The forest lit up like a camera flash, blinding white that left after images in the dark. The jackals scattered, shouting, disoriented. Two of them tripped over wire traps Caleb had laid earlier, tumbling into the brush. Elena's team moved then, not with guns, but with lights, noise, and confusion. More emitters activated, flooding the woods with sound. Howling wind, distorted animal calls, the blare of emergency sirens. It was disorienting, chaotic, effective. Walter's voice came in on the radio. East trail blocked. 2 turned back. No movement past the ridge. Maya chimed in. We've got visual, cameras rolling, posting live footage in 60 seconds. Everything was going to plan until Rex Maddox showed up. He wasn't supposed to be here. He never came to these runs himself, but he stepped out of the tree line like a ghost, slow and deliberate, eyes scanning the chaos without blinking. He was wearing a dark jacket instead of his usual vest, but there was no mistaking him. His presence shifted the energy instantly. The men regrouped around him like dogs returning to their alpha. Caleb ducked lower behind the rocks, watching through the lens. Rex wasn't yelling. He wasn't barking orders. He was calm, too calm. He knew this wasn't random. Each name was connected to unsolved internal investigations, all of them dismissed without follow-up. Drug movement, missing evidence, refused warrants. Each name had one common contact, a private contractor group registered to an out-of-state security firm called Apex Armament. Maya cross-referenced the company's tax filings. Its board included a silent partner, T. Bauer. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't just corruption. It was infrastructure. Down the road, Caleb was back at the ranger station, working on a new trail, grid. His maps were more complex now, layered with real-time data from camera traps, animal movement, even heat signatures from drones Walter helped configure with parts he'd bartered for over years. The forest had become their chessboard, and every tree was now a piece in a long game. He leaned over the table and ran a fingertip along a narrow trail just north of Red Creek. 2 new sets of boot prints had been found there. Not jackals, 2. Clean, too, even. Military boots. He circled the area, then marked it with red ink. Another intrusion. Elena stepped in, brushing snow off her shoulders. "Bauer's setting up something big," she said, voice tight. "I pulled satellite scans. That SUV wasn't just driving in loops. It was marking coordinates. They've started clearing brush near the old fire tower." Caleb turned to her. "For what?" "Staging point, maybe a relay hub. Could be a holding area." "For people?" Elena hesitated. "Or product?" Walter came in behind her, holding a small folder. "I think it's both." He laid down a set of photos, taken from a long-range lens, Bauer and 2 jackals, unloading crates from a black van. One crate had the U.S. Army Corps insignia on it. Another bore the mark of a private security firm that had been disbanded 5 years ago. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "They're moving weapons." "More than that," Walter said. "They're moving logistics. This isn't a gang using the forest. This is a network built into it." They all went silent. Maya arrived 30 minutes later with the documents she'd compiled. She spread them out across the table, hands trembling slightly from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. "I've tracked 5 different smuggling routes tied to this town," she said. "1 leads south into Arizona. 2 run east toward Colorado Springs. The other 2 use old ranger fire trails that have been off maps for over a decade. And every single one is protected by someone in uniform, either local law enforcement or private contractors." Elena crossed her arms. "That explains the silence. Every time we've tried to report anything, it dies before it reaches Denver." Walter leaned forward, eyes dark. "It also means Ridge Hollow is more than just a hub. It's a test site." Caleb's voice was quiet. "For what?" Maya pulled up a photo on her tablet. One of the crates Bauer had unloaded. This one had a serial number. She traced it back through an export manifest from a former U.S. military base. Unregistered tracking devices, field drones, thermal imaging scopes, all sold off after decommissioning, supposed to be destroyed. "But they weren't," Elena muttered. "That's how they've been staying ahead of us. They know what we're doing before we do it, Maya said, because they've turned Ridge Hollow into a live-fire logistics test, one where they get to run product, test tech, and disappear anyone who stumbles into it. Caleb looked at Walter. That means this was never about the town. No, Walter said, but we made it about the town, and now they have to fight. To keep the secret, outside the wind picked up again. Snow danced through the trees like ash. And down the road, Bauer drove past the school for the second time that day. That evening, Maya sent an encrypted message to her contact at a national media outlet. She didn't include everything, just enough to raise questions, enough to make someone in Washington start sniffing around. She attached one line to the end of her message. If anything happens to us, you'll know where to look. At the cabin that night, Caleb checked the cameras one by one. Every feed was still up except one, the one near the fire tower. The last image it captured was the glint of a rifle barrel, and then static. He stood, heart pounding. They know we're watching. Walter didn't look up. Let them! Eleanor stepped through the door. We've got movement coming in from the west, not jackals, military trucks, markings stripped, then walked in without waiting for a response. No one saw him leave. 2 hours later, Eleanor received a call on her encrypted line. It lasted only 22 seconds. She didn't speak during it. When it ended, she sat down at the edge of the table, eyes hard. He wants to talk, she said. Bauer? Maya asked. Elena nodded. He wants Caleb brought in. Everyone looked at the boy. He called him a juvenile eco-terrorist, said he's interfering with federal operations. Caleb blinked. That's not even real. Walter stood, fists clenched. That's what they do. Turn the target into the threat. If they can't kill you, they'll make you into the villain. Maya shook her head. He's trying to bait us. He's trying to scare us, Elena said. And he's trying to establish control. If we give in now, it'll be martial law disguised as a cleanup operation. Caleb exhaled. So what do we do? Walter answered first. We get smarter. The following night, they locked down the network. Every piece of data was copied 3 times and distributed to safe zones. Caleb wasn't allowed to leave the perimeter alone. Eleanor rerouted drone signals through a scrambled relay that masked their location. Maya scheduled anonymous leaks to national watchdog outlets, timed over the next month, so even if something happened to her, the information would survive. Bauer began moving more publicly. He shook hands at the diner, drove slow past local homes, nodded politely to the school principal when he passed. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Cameras picked up 2 more SUVs parked near the southern ridge. Caleb spotted strangers, asking questions at the gas station. Elena intercepted a message on a scrambled frequency. Priority target is the Dawson kid. Pressure the ranger. Lock down the journalist. The forest itself began to feel like a trap. One afternoon, Caleb walked the west trail with Walter. They didn't speak much, just moved through the quiet, listening. Walter stopped by a line of fresh claw marks on a tree trunk, not recent but deep. Milo's alive, he said. Caleb nodded. I know. He's staying hidden now, same as us, because he knows something's changed. Walter didn't respond right away. Then he said, the forest has memory. It doesn't forget what you do to it. These men came here thinking it was just land, just trees. They don't understand what they've provoked. At night, the wind seemed louder. Caleb sat at the cabin window watching the trees, waiting. Then just after midnight he saw it, a figure standing at the far tree line. Not a bear, not a jackal, not Rex Bauer, the federal marshal, standing alone, arms folded, watching the cabin. He didn't move for almost 5 minutes. Then he raised one hand, just a little wave, and walked back into the dark. The next morning, Elena called an emergency session. They're not hiding anymore, she said. And if they're not hiding, it means they think they've already won. Caleb looked around the room. Then it's time we show them we're not running. And Walter, voice steady, added, It's time we fight like the forest does, quiet, patient, and with no mercy when the time comes, because it would come, sooner than any of them expected. The first hard frost came that week, blanketing Ridge. Hollow in silver silence, the streets looked cleaner than usual, softer, almost peaceful, but no one was fooled. Beneath that frozen calm, something ugly was coiling tighter, like a rope winding around the town's throat. Marshal Trent Bauer's arrival had changed the rules. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was weaving himself into the fabric of Ridge Hollow, one step, one handshake, one threat at a time. Maya Ortega sat in her office above the library, the charred scent of the recent fire still faint beneath the new coat of paint. She hadn't slept in 30 hours. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the darkness, dozens of tabs open, documents layered over maps, maps layered over phone records. Her hands moved fast across the keys, piecing together fragments of a puzzle no one had been willing to acknowledge. Until now. The Crimson Jackals were never just a gang. Ridge Hollow was never just an outpost. This was something bigger, far bigger. She opened the folder Eleanor had given her the night before, labeled only Whisper Chain. Inside were 3 names, all law enforcement officials from different counties across 3 states. But we have footage of 2 jackals pulling a duffel from the cabin earlier this week. I matched one of them to a federal fugitive. Copy that, Elena said. We'll hold the footage, release it if they retaliate. Caleb leaned against a tree, out of breath but steady. We're getting ahead of them, he said. No, Walter replied, his voice coming over the line. We're making them reckless. That's better. Back at the station, they debriefed. They had names, they had routes, they had footage, they had a plan. And they had something else. Momentum. Rex Maddox would feel it, and when he did, he'd strike back harder than ever. They just had to be ready when he did. Caleb stood at the edge of the ranger station's roof just before dawn, binoculars in hand, the wind slicing through his coat. Below, Ridge Hollow slept as if nothing had changed, as if the woods beyond the town's edge weren't pulsing with danger. The night had gone mostly quiet, too quiet, and that worried him. The jackals didn't like being humiliated. And after the failed drop, the disoriented scouts, and the truck they'd intercepted, it wasn't a matter of if they'd retaliate, it was when. Walter joined him on the roof a few minutes later. He didn't say anything, just stood beside him, hands in his pockets, scanning the tree line like he had a 6th sense for when something was about to go wrong. Caleb had noticed that about his grandfather. There was no panic in him, not even now, just stillness. He was the kind of man who had already buried the worst of what he'd seen and carried what was left without complaint. At 5:47 a.m., Elena's voice crackled through the radio. We've got movement on the East Trail. Unfamiliar vehicle. Black. SUV. Federal plates. Caleb's brows furrowed. Another agent, Maya responded from the other end. Not one of ours. No heads up from Denver and no contact on the open channels. He's not here to coordinate, Walter muttered. Then he's here to watch. They regrouped at the cabin before breakfast. Elena had already pulled camera footage from the perimeter near the Hollow Point Trail. The SUV appeared like a shark. Sleek, dark, without sound. It had coasted up the dirt path, parked near an old ranger post, and sat there for 27 minutes before pulling back into the trees. Look at the tag, Elena said, pausing the footage and zooming in. Caleb leaned. Closer. Government rental. Out of Flagstaff. Maya tapped a folder on the table. That matches a report I pulled from an old whistleblower case. Name came up 3 times in connection with illegal trafficking investigations that went nowhere. Eleanor nodded. Trent. Bauer. Walter froze. Marshal Trent Bauer, he repeated. You know him? Caleb asked. Walter's jaw tightened. I knew his type. Worked alongside one like him during my last year in the field. Badge on his chest, blood on his boots. He doesn't follow the law. He sells it. They all went quiet. Elena broke the silence. We're not just dealing with a gang anymore. We're dealing with a pipeline, a protected one. And Bauer is the reason no one's come to shut it down. Maya placed a photo on the table. It showed Rex, Maddox, and Bauer shaking hands at a hunting event in Arizona, both dressed like gentlemen. Drinks in hand, a wild boar strung behind them like a trophy. This wasn't just business, she said. They've known each other for years. Walter sighed and leaned against the table. So now they're bringing in firepower with a badge. That changes things. Elena frowned. It means the Jackals have someone who can burn evidence, stall federal reports, and redirect any meaningful investigation before it touches Ridge Hollow. It also means the footage we've collected is more valuable than we thought. Caleb's voice was low. It means we're exposed. That afternoon, the SUV returned, this time in daylight. It drove slow, like a predator circling prey, passing every key point in town. The school, the library, the post office. It parked in front of the sheriff's department for 13 minutes. Then the door opened. Marshal Trent Bauer stepped out. He was clean-cut, hair slicked back, boots polished. He wore no name tag, no jacket with insignia, just a grey collared shirt and black pants. He walked with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. Walter, watching from behind the blinds of the old church basement, narrowed his eyes. Bauer knocked once on the sheriff's door. That's why we can't treat this like a local threat anymore. This is organized, and if we don't outplan them, we don't last the winter. Caleb stepped forward. Then we stop thinking like victims. He moved to the table and unrolled a hand-drawn schematic of the forest trails surrounding Ridge Hollow. This is their corridor. We've confirmed at least 3 active transport paths through the North Ridge and 2 on the southern basin. They rotate vehicles, keep patterns loose, but they always run 1 truck behind 3 bikes. It's their fallback plan. The truck carries cargo, the bikes scout and block. He circled a narrow pass with red ink. This here, the Hollow Point Trail, is our best choke. It curves along the natural bluff. No other way through without doubling. Back 10 miles. Elena leaned in. So we funnel them. Walter crossed his arms. And catch them how? We can't take them head on. Caleb tapped the paper again. We don't. We distract them, force them off course, make them think the route is compromised. And then we hit their drop point when they're too busy trying to recover. Which means bait, Maya said. Everyone looked at Caleb. He didn't flinch. I'll do it. Walter's voice broke the silence. No, I'm the only one. Who knows the ridge well enough to slip through without being seen? They already think I'm the one stirring the pot. They're watching me anyway. Might as well give them something to follow. Walter looked like he wanted to shout. His jaw worked hard as he held back a reaction, but eventually he nodded once. Not out of agreement, but because he understood. You move at night, he said. Only under fog, and you don't carry anything that can tie you to us if they grab you. I won't get grabbed. You make sure of it, Elena stepped in. I'll coordinate ambush positions. We won't use weapons, not unless absolutely necessary, but we will use flashbangs, sound traps, motion alarms, everything that disorients and confuses. I've already got supplies stashed. Maya handed Caleb a burner phone. This stays off until you're clear. Only turn it on if you need extraction. Caleb pocketed it. They spent the next 2 days setting up. The old ranger station became the heartbeat of the operation. Elena taught Caleb how to set up perimeter triggers without wires, thin fishing line between pine branches that triggered pressure clicks. Walter drilled him in movement, how to breathe without making sound, how to listen to the birds for warnings, how to read the wind like a story. The forest talks, Walter told him, showing him how to kneel by a ridge and press his ear to the dirt. You just got to know what language it speaks. On the 3rd night, Caleb stood at the edge of the ridge. He wore a faded green coat, black gloves, soft boots. He had a small backpack, a map, and nothing else. The moon was half full. The fog was rolling low, slipping over the trees like mist from a slow breath. He looked down into the clearing below. No lights yet, no movement, but he knew they were coming. Behind him, Eleanor's voice came through the earpiece. Phase 1. You're clear to move. Caleb descended. He moved like a shadow between pines, each step placed with intention. His pulse slowed. He could hear everything: the wind through brittle leaves, the distant crack of a twig, the rustle of a bird taking off in the dark. He crossed 2 ridges and hit the outer trail. From there he left the map behind and moved into instinct. 15 minutes later, 3 engines roared to life somewhere behind him. The bait had worked. He moved faster now, angling left, crossing into the blind spot they had marked earlier. Ahead, the path narrowed between 2 stone outcrops. Just past that, the diversion trap waited. Flash bangs rigged to a proximity sensor tied to a deer trail. If they followed him, they'd hit it. He ducked into a ravine and crouched. Minutes passed, then came the sound, tires on wet dirt, voices echoing low and fast. The bikers were close, too close, then pop flash, screaming. The forest lit up with white-blue light. He used the chaos to move, breaking off and circling wide. He found the camera trap they'd planted, checked the lens, and aimed it toward the chaos. Let them watch themselves fail. By the time he reached the rendezvous point, Elena was already waiting. "They took the bait," she said. "And the drop point?" Maya's voice came through the earpiece. "Truck is empty. No weapons." He didn't know why he'd brought it, just that something in him said he should. Slowly, inch by inch, he moved closer until he was kneeling beside the great beast. He whispered, "I'm not here to hurt you." Milo blinked. The wound was on his shoulder, deep, raw, seared black around the edges, like it had come from fire. Not a bullet. Not a knife. Something worse. A homemade incendiary. Caleb didn't know, but he pressed the gauze gently to the wound. And Milo flinched, but didn't strike. He stayed there an hour, tending to the wound in silence. When he left, the bear didn't stop him. He looked back once, and Milo was watching, always watching. By dawn, Caleb was back at the cabin. His clothes were soaked, his fingers numb, but his mind clear. They tried to destroy everything, he told Walter, who had stayed awake through the night, refusing to sleep. But they failed. Walter didn't speak. "We're going to rebuild. Not just the cabin, not just the network, everything. We're going to take it back." Walter looked at him for a long time, then nodded once. "You sound like your mother," he said. Caleb froze. "You never talk about her." "I didn't think you needed to know," Walter said, looking away. "But you're leading now, and that means knowing what came before." He stood slowly, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out a small, dust-covered box. Inside was a badge, Forest Service, gold-rimmed, weathered. "That was hers," Walter said. "She died protecting a ridgeline from poachers, stood her ground alone, held them off until backup came. She was 32. Caleb stared at the badge, emotion threatening to choke him. "She'd be proud," Walter said. Caleb nodded. So would Milo. That evening, Maya returned to the cabin. She hadn't slept either. She carried a new laptop, a backup drive, and a list of every name from the resistance that was still standing. "They hit us," she said. "Hard. But they left a trail. Sloppy. Angry. And I followed it." She pulled out a photo. It showed Rex Maddox standing with a man Caleb didn't recognize. Suit, badge, federal pin. "Marshal Trent Bauer," Maya said. "Corrupt, suspended twice, still working freelance. Guess who just bought property on the far edge of town?" Walter stood. "That's the man pulling strings." "No," Elena said from the corner. "That's the man we're going to expose next. Because now it wasn't just about Ridge Hollow. It was bigger, darker, and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The air in Ridge Hollow had lost its softness. The wind was sharper now, even when the sun broke through the clouds. It wasn't just the changing season. It was the feeling that something unseen had turned its full attention on the town. Something organized, something waiting to strike again. No one said it out loud, but everyone could feel it in the back of their throats. A silence before the next storm. Caleb spent most of the next day repairing what he could. The cabin door had been replaced with a heavier one. The windows now had steel bars hidden behind the curtains. Walter's maps, redrawn from memory, were pinned back to the wall. And above the mantel, where the old hunting rifle used to hang, Caleb had mounted something new, his field sketches of Milo, 4 different angles, 4 different stances, all from recent footage. The bear had become more than a presence. He was now a part of the strategy. They gathered at the old ranger station 2 nights later. Elena took point, stepping into the role without ceremony. There was no time for formalities. Everyone knew the stakes. The room had been cleared of its dust and disuse, now transformed into a makeshift operations hub. Maps covered the walls, each marked with different colored pins. Dossiers lined the corkboards. Flashlights, radios, printouts, and gear were stacked across tables. The room smelled of burnt coffee, cold air, and urgency. Elena stood in front of the main map. "They've escalated," she said. "We knew they would. But the level of coordination in the last attack wasn't just gang violence, it was military. That means someone's trained them, or someone is running them from higher up. Bauer, most likely." Maya spoke from the side, her voice steady but hoarse. "He's not just helping them cover tracks. He's clearing space for them. Routes, timing, silence from the state level when reports get filed. It's not just corruption, it's complicity." Walter nodded grimly. The smoldering wood finally nodded. "Yes," he said, "now it is." Back at the cabin, Caleb opened his notebook. Not for sketches this time. He began drawing something else. Traps, routes, safe zones, pressure triggers, noise emitters. His hands moved fast, but his eyes were cold. In the corner of the page, he drew a bear, and underneath it he wrote, "The forest remembers." Caleb didn't recognize the cabin when he got home. The door was hanging open, hinges broken, wood splintered like a tree hit by lightning. Windows shattered, the floor covered in a thin layer of mud and boot prints. The kitchen was ransacked, cabinets thrown open, plates shattered, drawers overturned. Walter's old maps were missing from the wall. The radio was smashed, and on the table, surrounded by overturned chairs and shards of glass, lay a bloodied boot. Walter's boot. Caleb's chest tightened as he stepped inside, eyes scanning for movement, fingers trembling around the knife in his belt. He called out, once, then again. Nothing. Just the creak of broken wood underfoot and the cold air blowing through what was left of the front window. He found Walter in the back room. His grandfather was on the floor, blood on his temple, shirt torn, lip split, one eye swollen shut. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't fully awake either. His breathing was shallow. Caleb knelt beside him, gently tapping his shoulder, voice cracking. "Grandpa, hey, can you hear me?" Walter's hand twitched. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, but only a whisper came out. Two of them took the hard drive. Caleb's heart pounded. "Which one?" Walter blinked slowly. "Maya's backup, the one in the crawl space. They knew where to look." He gritted his teeth and started to sit up, but Caleb held him down. "Don't move." "Boy, I'm fine," Walter said, but his voice had none of its usual steel. "You're not." Elena arrived within 20 minutes. Caleb had called her on the emergency line, his voice tight, his words clipped. She brought a medical kit, patched Walter up as best she could, and helped him into the armchair by the fire, now roaring with fresh logs. "They didn't just want to hurt him," she said. "They wanted to break this place." Caleb nodded, staring at the wreckage of the den. The bookshelves overturned, the broken picture frames, the old photo of Walter in uniform now lying under shattered glass. Everything sacred had been touched, defiled. And then Elena said something that stopped Caleb cold. "Milo's blood matches the sample we found at the base of the ridge." He turned slowly. "You tested it?" She nodded. "It's his. There's no mistake." And Elena paused. "He's injured. Badly. He lost a lot of blood. But he's not dead. Not yet." Caleb exhaled and clenched his fists. "They're not just going after us. They're going after the forest." That afternoon, the cabin was repaired as best it could be. Boards nailed over windows, furniture uprighted, but nothing felt the same. The air was different, cold in a way that went deeper than the skin. Walter didn't speak much. He kept his eyes on the fire, one hand wrapped tightly around his old ranger knife, like he expected someone to kick the door in again at any moment. That night, Caleb didn't sleep. He took his notebook, his gear, and disappeared into the woods. He moved through the trees like a ghost, memory guiding his steps. His feet knew where not to tread. His hands brushed against moss and bark as he passed landmarks he'd known since childhood. The fallen tree near the stream, the crooked rock that looked like a wolf's head, the path where Milo used to cross at dawn. He didn't find the bear that night, but he found something else. Tracks, blood, a trail. He followed it for hours, deeper, into the wilderness than he'd ever gone alone. The trees closed in above him, thick with fog and silence. Every branch felt like a warning. Every step felt heavier than the last. And then he saw it, Milo's den, not the one near the cabin. A new one, hastily made, carved into a shallow cave beneath a ridge of stone. Caleb approached slowly, crouching low, flashlight off. The scent hit him first. Blood, fur, damp earth. Milo was inside, lying still, his chest rising and falling slowly. The bear's eyes opened. Amber, alert. Caleb froze. Milo didn't move. Caleb reached into his bag, pulled out a bottle of antiseptic and a wad of gauze. Within 20 feet of a known gang truck, Caleb had seen the way Milo sniffed the air, how he circled wide, how he paused behind a ridge and waited, always waiting, always silent. And then, just as the truck pulled away, Milo turned, not to follow, but to look directly at the camera. As if he knew, as if he chose. The cabin lights flickered just as Walter stepped outside. "Your camera grid just blinked," he said. "All 3 on the east perimeter." Caleb stood instantly. Could be deer. Walter shook his head. They all blinked at the same time. "That's not deer. That's human." They moved fast, quiet, rifles strapped and knives in their belts. Caleb knew the trail better than any of them, but even he felt the unease, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a living forest. When they reached the east cameras, the truth was obvious. Each had been slashed from its tree, not yanked, not smashed, slashed. Precision cuts through the mounting straps, done quickly, quietly, no footprints, no tire tracks. Nothing but a cigarette, but with a red lipstick mark pressed against a nearby rock. Elena found it the next morning. "Message received," she said, but she didn't sound scared. She sounded focused. Across town, the resistance network felt the heat. Glenn Archer found a dead raccoon nailed to the door of his feed store. Riley was followed home by a motorcycle that never turned its headlights on. Benny had his brake lines cut. He found out only because the engine stalled before he pulled out of the driveway. And still, they didn't stop. They just got quieter, more careful. But the jackals weren't done. 2 nights after Maya's office was torched, Walter woke up to a strange sound outside. Not a car, not boots, a small, slow crunch, like someone stepping on frozen leaves and trying not to. He grabbed his shotgun, flicked the safety off, and moved toward the window. A figure stood at the tree line, leather vest, dark jeans, a phone in his hand, raised like a torch. Walter watched as the man slowly turned the phone's flashlight toward the cabin, then toward the barn, then toward the small den just behind the chicken coop, the place where Caleb had once found Milo sleeping under a ridge of rock years ago. And then the man smiled. He didn't speak, didn't move, just smiled. Walter stepped out onto the porch and raised the shotgun. "Get off my land!" The man stayed put, last warning. Still no movement. Then, slowly, he clicked off the flashlight and vanished into the trees. Caleb didn't sleep that night, neither did Walter. The next morning, Caleb found something beneath the woodpile where he kept the spare camera traps. A photo, printed on cheap paper, crumpled but dry. It showed Caleb standing outside the ranger station 2 days prior, talking to Maya and Elena. He didn't remember seeing anyone nearby. On the back of the photo was a single sentence written in block letters. "Not so invisible now, are you?" Walter gathered the resistance that evening. No more half measures. They doubled the relay shifts, posted lookouts at every corner of town, used old CB radios to avoid digital trace. Elena rigged a jamming device to block signals near the ranger station. Maya started hiding hard drives in the crawl spaces of houses, barns, even the church basement. But Rex Maddox had one more move to make. The town was asleep when the gunshots echoed across Ridge Hollow. 3 sharp cracks. Then silence. Caleb sat up in bed before he was fully awake. Walter was already at the door, weapon in hand. They waited. Nothing followed, no engines, no yelling, just silence, and then the smell, smoke. They followed it to the edge of the North Ridge. Milo's den was burning. The fire was small, contained, but purposeful. Someone had poured accelerant inside and torched it. A warning, or a kill. The claw marks on the surrounding trees told the rest of the story. Milo had been there. There had been a struggle. Blood streaked the leaves. Tufts of fur matted with ash littered the rocks. No sign of the bear. Walter stood at the edge of the blackened den, jaw clenched, fists tight. Caleb knelt, fingers brushing the dirt like he could will something back from it. This was his home, he whispered. Walter didn't speak. He just placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. But Caleb pulled away. No, this isn't just about us anymore. This is war, and Walter, looking at the ruined den, the claw marks. People who never left their houses began taking long walks with burner phones in their coat pockets. It became normal to see Walter at the gas station just checking the weather, or to find Caleb at the edge of town with a sketchbook that now held maps instead of wildlife. But the jackals noticed. They always noticed. It started with the dogs. One by one, pets went missing. Then tires were slashed and porch lights shot out. No one claimed it. No one admitted it. But they all knew. Glenn's store was egged twice in a week. Dee's front window was broken. A brick thrown through Benny's. Garage door came with a message written in marker. "You're next, soldier." Still, they didn't stop. Elena responded by planting cameras. Maya started releasing small pieces of their findings to online sources. Nothing too explosive, just enough to build attention. Anonymous posts, leaks, hashtags. A few went viral. National news didn't bite, but the local networks started to sniff. Something was happening in Ridge Hollow, and that made Rex Maddox, leader of the Crimson Jackals, very interested. Caleb saw him once, up close. It was at the diner. Rex stood near the jukebox, one hand on his belt, the other holding a coffee mug. He hadn't paid for. He smiled too easily. His teeth were too white. His eyes never blinked enough. He watched everyone, even while he laughed. And when he looked at Caleb, it wasn't like a man looking at a kid. It was like a wolf staring at something that didn't belong in his woods. Later that night, Caleb walked into the barn and found the wildlife camera he'd hidden behind the stalls smashed in half. A single note was taped to the hay bales. "Stay blind, little boy, or go silent." He brought it to Walter. The old man said nothing, just opened a drawer, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began writing something down. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked. Walter looked up, eyes cold. "Calling an old friend. Time to even the field." The next day, Elena intercepted a communication between regional gang nodes. Her name popped up in a brief message sent from a phone connected to a burner tower out of Arizona. It said, simply, "Federal eyes. Ridge Hollow is hot. Pull the kids. Send someone to watch the old ranger." They were being hunted now, but they had stopped running, and deep in the forest, Milo was watching too. Ridge Hollow hadn't known peace in months, but after the resistance began to stir, things took a darker, colder turn. The jackals weren't content with being watched. They didn't like the silence on the streets. They didn't like the lowered eyes and the hushed voices. They especially didn't like that people weren't afraid enough. Fear was control. And someone was bleeding that fear out of the town. That meant retaliation. It started on a Sunday night. The first target was Maya. She had just returned from a meeting with Elena and Caleb at the ranger station. Her office above the library had long been converted into a quiet command post. New routers, hidden behind old bookcases, encrypted drives stacked beside dusty headlines that never got published. She locked up, keys still in hand, when she smelled smoke, burnt plastic, charred paper. She ran up the stairs 2 at a time, heart thudding, adrenaline charging through her veins before her thoughts could catch up. The door was kicked in. Everything inside was smoldering. Her laptop melted into slag, her backup drive scorched, her printer overturned. The walls were blackened with soot. But the damage wasn't the worst part. The message was written across. The plaster in thick red paint, almost crimson, almost the same color as the jackal patch, were 3 words: "Bears bleed too." Maya froze. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, but her hands trembled because whoever did this didn't come for files. They came to humiliate, to mark her, and to send a message to the boy she had aligned herself with, the boy with the cameras. The boy with the bear, Caleb. Elena, arrived 7 minutes later. She didn't speak when she saw the walls. She pulled out a burner, called Walter, and relayed what happened with clipped military precision. "They're escalating," she said. "We need to assume everyone's compromised." Walter's voice was like gravel on the other end. "They've picked the wrong forest." Meanwhile, Caleb sat on the porch of the cabin, Milo's most recent appearance looping on the tablet screen in his lap. The bear had come closer this time. By the end of the week, Ridge Hollow had split itself into 2 camps. Those who feared the jackals and those who refused to. The second camp was small, but it was growing, and soon it would fight back. The first real meeting of the resistance wasn't held in a town hall or under a flag. It happened in the basement of an old church that no longer held sermons. The paint peeled from the walls, the pipes leaked when it rained, and the electricity flickered every time someone turned on a second light. But it was quiet, unwatched, forgotten, and in Ridge Hollow, those were the safest places left. Elena arrived first, carrying a duffel bag that weighed more than it looked. Inside were burner phones, printed satellite photos, lists of license plates, and a map with red ink slashing through the woods like blood. Maya came next, arms full of manila folders and a second-hand laptop with a cracked screen that still held every note she'd taken since the jackals arrived. Walter entered behind her, his old service coat zipped tight against the cold, boots heavy with the weight of history. Caleb followed, not as a child watching adults work, but as the one who had started all of it. 3 other townsfolk joined them that night. Glenn Archer, who owned the feed store and had quietly stopped selling supplies to anyone with a jackal patch. D. Riley, the librarian, who had started hiding books about civil resistance and surveillance behind the gardening section. And Benny Rios, a mechanic who once served in Iraq and still kept his military ID tucked into his wallet like a ghost he hadn't buried yet. No one said the word resistance out loud. They called it what Walter had called it when he spoke to Archer in the back lot of the store. "We're just watching," he'd said. Now, in that cold basement, they watched together. Elena passed out the phones first. "Only use these. They're unregistered, short range. If you need to go dark, smash them. If you don't think you can carry that weight, walk out now." No one moved. She circled the map next. "These are known routes through the forest. The jackals don't use main roads for supply movement. They operate nocturnally, usually between midnight and 4. We've caught them crossing over 2 ridgelines and using old ranger trails. That's our advantage. Walter knows this terrain better than anyone alive." Caleb cleared his throat, nervous. "I've started tracking their movement schedules. When they pass through the East Ridge, it's every other night. When they come from the west, it's always 3 bikes and 1 truck. They're staggered on purpose to confuse." Maya added, "They're also using intimidation on rotation. Same families, different nights. It's targeted, psychological. A burn barrel here, a missing dog there. They're trying to make people feel surrounded." "They're succeeding," Glenn said, arms crossed. Nobody looks anyone in the eye anymore. That's why we're doing this, Walter said. This town has a spine. We just have to remind it. For the next hour, they planned. Routes, check-ins, shifts. Elena created a relay system. One person in every major zone who could rotate surveillance and pass along data without alerting suspicion. Maya worked with Dee to develop drop spots for information, tucked inside books, under trash bins, slipped between walls of cracked brick. Benny began rigging motion sensors to old security lights and wired a back channel into the town's generator control box. If they needed darkness, they could kill the power to half the street in under 5 seconds. Caleb hung new cameras, higher this time, where even the sharpest eyes couldn't see them. In one clip, a gang member reached into a hollowed tree trunk, pulled out a package, and walked off without checking his surroundings. He watched the video 6 times, then he showed it to Maya. They traced the man back to the sheriff's house. It was all but confirmed then. The law belonged to the jackals, so they stopped relying on it. Within a week, the resistance had grown from 7 to 24. Quietly, carefully, people who had seen enough, lost enough, broken just enough to say yes when asked. They didn't fight, not yet. They watched, they listened, they tracked. Every plate, every whisper, every transaction. They made copies and hid them in floorboards. They started shifting routines. People who used to go home by 6 now stayed out until 10. And she hadn't come empty-handed. They use the forest as a corridor, she explained, pointing to a map. Remote, dense, no surveillance. It's the perfect cover. They move weapons, drugs, cash, sometimes people. And they don't stick around unless they're profiting. Caleb leaned over the table. So how do we stop them? We don't, Eleanor said. Not directly, that's suicide. What we do is document, record, leak, expose. Build a case so strong, even the dirtiest lawman can't cover it up. Walter nodded. That's why I called you. Elena glanced toward the window. Who else knows? A reporter, Maya Ortega. I read her stuff, Elena said. She's gutsy, but gutsy people don't live long when they're alone. She's not alone, Caleb said. That same night, Maya drove back to the cabin. She brought files, printed photos, USB drives, and a stack of articles that never got published. Stories about gang intimidation, unexplained fires, and a sheriff who'd stopped issuing warrants after the jackals arrived. They've got the mayor's ear, she said, and I'm betting they've got something on the sheriff too. Elena studied the documents. You're sitting on a bombshell, she said. I'm sitting on gasoline, Maya corrected. You bring the match. Caleb stood nearby, restless. It's not enough. What isn't? Maya asked, exposing them. They don't care about the law. They think they own the town. Walter spoke then, his voice low. They do. There was silence after that, a heavy truth none of them wanted to carry, but all of them understood. The jackals had moved in quietly, slowly, but now they were everywhere. At the diner, at the mechanics, in the bar. They walked the streets like they were patrolling territory, not visiting it. And the town had let them, because fear makes cowards out of the best people. So they planned. Caleb, Elena, Walter, and Maya began mapping out every lead, every hiding spot, every sighting. Caleb took more cameras into the woods, hiding them, in tree trunks and under broken logs. Elena tapped into regional wildlife systems, quietly rerouting her field notes into encrypted folders. Maya prepped a file dump to release online if anything happened to them. They worked in silence under cover of darkness, because they didn't know who was watching. At night, the jackals made their presence known. Engines revved through town. At 2 a.m., headlights flashing into windows. The gas station was vandalized. A family's dog was taken, its collar left on the porch. Just a warning, the note said. Fear spread faster than truth. But still, the resistance began to grow. Walter contacted 2 of his old ranger buddies, retired, quiet, loyal. They sent burner phones and satellite maps. Caleb convinced a local shop owner to let them use his attic as a surveillance post. Elena tapped into a Department of Wildlife satellite, giving them night scans of the clearing the jackals used for supply drops. And then there were the stories. Maya started collecting them. Quiet conversations in parking lots, whispered confessions, from business owners too afraid to speak loud. Stories of threats, of deals gone bad, of kids running errands they didn't understand. They built a network, one person at a time, and the jackals noticed. They didn't know who was behind the leaks, but they knew someone was watching. One of their lieutenants was found unconscious near the old logging road, bruised, stripped of his vest. A message was scratched into his motorcycle tank. Not all shadows belong to you. The gang retaliated hard. A gas station was torched. Maya's car was keyed. A woman's house was broken into. Nothing stolen, just everything turned upside down. Elena intercepted a comm from one of her contacts. The message was short. They're spooked. Someone's poking the bear. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, especially Caleb, because out in the woods, Milo had returned again. Caleb caught him on 3 cameras in one night, moving through the trees like smoke, always on the edges of gang activity, never confronting, just watching. One clip showed him standing less than 10 feet from a man loading boxes into a truck. The man never even saw him. He's following them, Caleb said, watching the footage. No. Walter murmured. He's hunting them. The forest had been wounded, disturbed, the balance disrupted, and Milo, raised by human hands but molded by the wild, had chosen his side. So had they. He took a USB drive with the footage and slipped into the back entrance of the library, where Maya Ortega still ran the paper, the Ridge Hollow Echo, even though no one bought it anymore. Maya was in her 30s, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, the kind of woman who didn't smile unless she meant it. Caleb trusted her. He didn't know why. Maybe because she didn't flinch when the jackals walked into the cafe across the street. Maybe because she still wrote headlines about what was happening, even if no one dared print them. He found her. In the back room, hunched over a computer, a half-empty coffee next to a pile of files. "I have something," Caleb said. She looked up, confused. "You're the Dawson kid, right?" He nodded and handed her the drive. "What's on it?" "Proof of what they're doing, of what they've brought into the forest." She hesitated. "If this is some prank, it's not." He turned to go, but paused at the door. "And there's a bear." She blinked. "A bear?" "You'll see." That night, Maya watched the footage 3 times. She didn't sleep either. The next morning, she drove out to the cabin. Caleb and Walter were splitting firewood. "You just became my most dangerous source," she said, stepping out of the car. Caleb glanced at his grandfather, who looked the reporter over with a veteran's caution. "I want to help," Maya said. "But if I publish that video, they'll burn my office down." Walter leaned on his axe. "They'll burn it anyway. Only question is when." "Then let's make it count," Caleb added. They spent the rest of the day in Walter's den going over the footage, making copies, planning drop-offs, backups. Maya had contacts, people outside Ridge Hollow who could amplify the story, who weren't afraid to dig into gang activity and corruption. She just needed time, evidence, strategy, and Caleb gave her all of it. That night the wind changed. The cold deepened, and out in the forest, something stirred. They were watching now, all of them, and it wasn't just Caleb anymore. The sun hadn't yet risen when Walter made the call. The signal was weak out near the cabin, but the number still worked. He hadn't dialed it in years. A string of digits burned into his mind, kept sacred and unused since the day he walked away from the service. The phone rang twice before a woman's voice answered, calm and clipped. "Elena Whitmore," she said. "It's Walter Dawson," he replied. "I need a favor, the kind you don't log." There was a pause. "How bad is it?" "They've set up shop in the woods. Gang, arms, smuggling routes. Corruption in town. Worse, kids are getting involved. My grandson found their stash." Another pause. "Longer this time. I'll be there in 48. What's the cover?" "You're conducting a wildlife population assessment." "Bears?" "Exactly." He hung up before she could say anything else. That's how they worked, always had. Short, precise, no emotion wasted. Walter stood on the porch for a long time afterward, watching the tree line, the frost climbing up the branches like ash. He could feel it again. The same weight he'd carried in the jungle, deep in the thicket, surrounded by enemies you never saw coming. The forest had rules, but the jackals weren't playing by any of them. Down the hill, Caleb was refilling. The chicken feeders. He looked up as his grandfather walked past. Was that Elena? Walter nodded. She's coming. Good, Caleb said. We're running out of time. Eleanor Whitmore arrived under the veil of dusk. She drove an unmarked truck, government issue but civilian enough not to draw attention. Inside were crates of field equipment, tracking collars, notebooks, trail cameras, everything she needed to look the part of a wildlife investigator. Everything else she carried was locked inside a black duffel Walter took into the cabin himself. Elena had changed since the last time Caleb saw her. Her hair was streaked with grey now, but her eyes were still sharp, steady, and unforgiving. She moved like a woman who didn't ask for permission and had never needed to. "You're taller," she said to Caleb, stepping from the truck. "You're armed," he said. She smirked. "Always." Inside the cabin, they laid everything out. Elena had intel of her own. A partial list of suspected jackal members operating in other states, connections between known biker gangs, and smuggling networks running across national parks and forests. She'd seen this before, not just in the buildings or in the hearts of the people, but in the very air itself. There was a heaviness now, a weight that pressed down on every step, every glance, every word spoken under breath. The kind of weight that comes when people realize help isn't coming. Not from the sheriff, not from the law, not from anyone. And in that space, where trust dies and fear takes root, someone always steps forward, whether they're ready or not. Caleb sat at the kitchen table long after. Walter had gone to bed. His fingers traced the edge of a faded map of the forest spread across the table. He had memorized the ridges, the clearings, the old ranger paths long ago, but now he was seeing them differently. Not as places of adventure or sanctuary, but as lines of movement, as corridors, as entry and exit points, as chokeholds, as traps. The ledger he'd found was gone, left behind when he ran. But the words were burned into his mind. Clearing 17B, Sunday, full run. He didn't know exactly what full run meant, but he had a damn good guess. Weapons, drugs, maybe worse. All he knew was that Sunday was in 3 days. He looked at Walter's old wildlife cameras stacked in a crate under the counter, dusty, untouched for years. They still worked. He'd fixed them himself during last winter, when boredom and snowstorms had made the cabin feel like a prison. Now they'd serve a different purpose. He spent the next day hiking. Not like before, not to explore. This time, he moved with focus, like a hunter. He found the old ranger blind near clearing 17B, still half-standing, the wood warped with age. It would give him cover. He hung the cameras in a perimeter, one pointed toward the clearing, one to the old trail the jackals seemed to favor, and one aimed downwind, just in case they changed course. When he returned to the cabin, Walter was on the porch, cleaning his shotgun. "It wasn't for hunting. You're setting traps," Walter said, not looking up. Caleb dropped his pack by the steps. "Cameras," Walter nodded once. "Good. Quiet traps. You're learning." Caleb sat beside him, brushing pine needles off his jeans. "What happens if I catch something?" Walter's eyes stayed on the weapon in his hands. "Then you don't go in alone." That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind scrape across the roof, the trees groaning like old men. He thought about the jackals, about the smirks on their faces, the smell of gasoline and smoke clinging to their clothes, about how they'd looked at this town and seen nothing worth preserving. He thought about the camera footage he might capture, real evidence, something no one could ignore. But he also thought about Milo. The memory of the bear moving silently behind the gang still made his skin prickle. It wasn't normal. Bears didn't track humans like that, not without reason, not without purpose. The next morning, Caleb reviewed the footage. The first few hours were empty. Squirrels, shadows, nothing more. But then, around 4:40 a.m., something moved across the northern camera. 3 bikes, no headlights. The men walked beside them, not riding, stealthier that way. One of them carried a long case, another a crate. They paused in the clearing, checking the treetops. Then something else. A massive figure emerged from the opposite ridge. Milo. The camera caught only the edge of his shape at first, just a ripple of fur and muscle against the trees. But then his full form stepped into view. He watched the men without sound, without motion. One of them looked up suddenly, like he felt something behind him. He froze. The other laughed and said something Caleb couldn't hear. The biker raised a flashlight, pointed it at the woods, and then dropped it. The beam had landed on Milo's face. The footage glitched for a second as the biker stumbled back, muttering something. They left quicker than they came, not running, but rattled, shaken. Milo didn't follow. He just stood there, watching. Caleb exhaled. His hands were trembling. He showed the footage to Walter. The old man leaned in close, eyes narrowed. He didn't speak for a long time. When the footage ended, Caleb finally asked, "You think he's following them?" Walter scratched the edge of his beard. "No, he's watching you." Caleb blinked. "Why me?" "Because you're the only thing in that forest that still belongs." The next day, Caleb went to town, carrying with it the smell of damp soil and something else, oil, gasoline. He found the gully again around noon. The duffel bag was gone, but the ground bore fresh boot prints. 3 pairs, heavy set, flattened branches showed where they had come and gone, not bothering to cover their trail. Caleb crouched, squinting at a nearby tree where sap had been scraped off, and then he saw it, barely tucked beneath a fallen log. A second bag, smaller, lighter. He pulled it out slowly, heart pounding. Inside were 2 pistols, 3 phones, wrapped in tape, and a leather-bound notebook. Pages filled with numbers, dates, lists of names. At the bottom of one page, underlined 3 times, was a phrase, "Clearing 17B, Sunday, full run." Caleb didn't have time to read more. A twig snapped above the ridge. "Hey!" a voice barked. "Down there! Kid!" Caleb's blood turned to ice. 2 jackals. One tall and wiry, with a scar across his cheek. The other broader, slower, chewing. A toothpick like it meant something. Both wore vests bearing the crimson jackal emblem. Both were already halfway down the ridge. Caleb dropped the bag and bolted. Branches whipped at his arms as he tore through the brush. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Their boots thundered after him, yelling curses and threats, snapping. Branches like firecrackers. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. But he kept running deeper into the woods until he saw it, a narrow rock wall sloping into a creek. He didn't think. He jumped. The water was colder than death. He hit hard, went under, and surfaced, gasping. The forest spun, but he kicked, clawed, dragged himself up the opposite bank. Behind him, the men had stopped at the ledge. "I ain't jumping after him," the big one growled. "He saw the ledger," the scarred one hissed. "He saw it. He's just a kid. No such thing as just a kid anymore." They stared across the creek for a few more seconds. Then they turned and vanished back into the trees. Caleb lay there, soaking wet, shivering, shaking, but alive. He didn't go home right away. He circled the long way around, through ridges and dry brush, until the sun was dipping low. By the time he pushed through the front door, Walter was already inside, rifle on the table, eyes locked on the door, like he'd been waiting for a ghost. "Where the hell were you?" he said, voice low, tired. Caleb didn't answer at first. He dropped his wet pack, peeled off his soaked jacket, and stood there in his muddy boots. "They saw me," he finally said. "I found more weapons, a ledger, names, dates. They chased me." Walter stood, not fast, not loud, but with purpose. He grabbed a towel, tossed it at the boy, and said, "You're lucky you didn't end up buried in a ditch." "I had to go." "No, you wanted to go." There's a difference. Caleb looked up, defiant. What's the point of living out here if we let people like that take it away from us? Walter stared at him for a long time. Then he sat down slowly, pulled a flask from his coat, and took a long drink. I get it, he said. I do, you've got fire. But fire'll burn your own house down if you don't learn how to aim it. The next morning, the town woke up to smoke. The community center, the only place kids could go after school, the same place where local meetings were held, had burned during the night. No one saw who did it. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew. Spray-painted on the charred wood frame were 4 words. Told you to listen. The sheriff arrived late. Left early. No arrests, no questions. Just a lot of shaking heads and clipped phrases. Caleb stood on the sidewalk, fists clenched, heart pounding. He didn't cry, not in front of them. But something inside him cracked. Walter walked up beside him, hands in his pockets, and said nothing for a while. I tipped them off, Caleb admitted. Walter didn't look at him. I figured. I couldn't stay quiet. You were right. Not to. Caleb turned. Then why are we still doing nothing? Walter finally looked him in the eye. There was no anger there, just sadness and resolve, because now, he said, it's time to do something. That night, Caleb watched the woods again from his window. Milo stood at the tree line, still, waiting. But this time, Caleb didn't just feel like the forest was watching. He felt like it was choosing sides. The fire at the community center had changed something in Ridge Hollow. Silent, amber eyes watching. Milo? Walter didn't say a word for a long time after Caleb told him what happened. They sat on the porch, the wind whispering through the pines. Walter's old coffee mug trembled slightly in his hand, and Caleb noticed his grandfather was scared, not of the bikers, but of what this meant. You said it yourself, Grandpa, the forest has rules. Walter nodded. It does. And they're breaking all of them. So what do? We wait. Caleb stared at him, stunned. Wait! They're hiding weapons, drugs, that bag I found. I know what you found. Walter's voice was hard now, like stone, under pressure. But listen to me, Caleb, these men, they're not just bikers, they're not just criminals, they're worse. They've rooted themselves deep, and the deeper they go, the more they infect. Infect? People, law, land. They'll rot everything from the inside out. Caleb looked out toward the woods. It didn't look different, not yet, but it felt it. Later that night, he crept outside with the wildlife camera. He wasn't going to wait. He couldn't. 2 days later, he checked the footage. Most of it was normal. A buck sniffing a branch, an owl fluttering past. But at 3:22 a.m., the camera caught something else. 3 bikers moving through the trees, armed, fast, no headlights. They weren't just hiding, they were transporting, and behind them, moving silently in the darkness, was Milo. He followed them, no aggression, just watching, tracking. Caleb replayed the footage again and again, and something clicked. Milo wasn't scared of them, he wasn't running, he was protecting. From that moment on, Caleb knew he couldn't stay silent. The next morning, the town square woke up to a message no one could ignore, spray-painted in blood-red letters across the brick wall of the town hall. Stay blind or go silent. The Crimson Jackals had marked their territory. The sheriff, a man once respected, barely looked up from his desk when confronted. They're just passing through, he muttered. But Walter knew better. They're not passing through, he whispered later, when he and Caleb stood outside the general store. They're digging in, and once they've nested, they'll burn every root around them. That evening, Walter called someone. Caleb didn't know who, but he caught the words Ranger Service and Whitmore. His voice was low, urgent, different. That night, Caleb looked out his bedroom window and saw Milo again, standing at the tree line, still, watching, and he knew in his gut that the forest wasn't silent anymore. It was waiting. It was listening. And it was angry. Some men fear the law, some fear the wild, But when the forest itself begins to rise, there's no hiding from what's coming. The air in Ridge Hollow had changed. It wasn't the shift from fall into winter, though the wind had begun to bite and the golden leaves now crunched underfoot. It was something heavier, something you couldn't quite name but could feel in your lungs. It was the weight of knowing something ugly was taking root in the shadows, and knowing most people were too scared to look it in the eye. Caleb Dawson had never been the kind to sit still, not even when his grandfather told him to. Especially not now. The images from his wildlife camera had looped in his mind for days. The bikers moving like ghosts through the trees, the hidden bags, the rifles, and most of all, Milo. The bear wasn't just watching, he was tracking them. Like he knew. Caleb didn't tell anyone else. Not the sheriff, not the school principal. He barely went to school anymore. Not since the crimson jackals had rolled in and started planting fear, like poison ivy, across every crack of the town. The sheriff had eyes, but no backbone. People whispered he was being paid off, though no one dared say it loud. Caleb didn't need proof. He just needed to see how the man flinched any time a jackal passed him in the street. That morning, Caleb skipped breakfast. Walter had gone into town early to pick up feed from a friend's farm, and Caleb used the quiet to slip deeper into the woods than he'd ever dared alone. He knew what he was looking for, the duffel, the gully, the place where the jackals were hiding their secrets. He carried a notepad, a flashlight, and a small field knife strapped to his hip, nothing that could help much in a fight, but enough to make him feel less helpless. The wind cut through the trees in slow waves.